Okay, chapter 5. So this is the last chapter, the very end of the book. It's her course assignments, notes, bibliography. This is the last full chapter. And what I think is really interesting, what I really love about this chapter, she starts at the very beginning, so I'm on page 151. And she says this chapter turns to writing to help public spheres assemble and reassemble. So again, we're orienting students towards and through public spheres, or public orientations, developing public orientations. Oh my goodness, my verbs. So her goal is to help instructors help students develop public orientations. So this chapter turns to writing to help public spheres assemble and reassemble. That's the whole goal, is assemblage and reassemblage, and that they come together, they break apart, and different types of audiences form, different outcomes associated with that, rhetorical practices throughout that, and then again, students transfer these to all sorts of different places, and they can do it more consciously towards better social action if they develop public orientation to realize audiences form alongside rhetorical practices that make certain outcomes possible. So they understand the basic formula, and they understand that they can apply that in various situations, and that is the public orientation that she's hoping for. And so then she separates these to mostly scaffold a process that moves from reflection to response to production. And what's really interesting is this models what we expect in a writing class. We want students to reflect on their writing, to name their practices, to talk through the decisions that they're making as a part of the response to existing texts or ideas or spaces. And then we want them to actually start producing. But also, this is not a linear process. I know I'm using process a lot because it's in there, but reflection is a circular process that's going to overlap with the response, and it's going to overlap with the production, and then the production is going to come back and impact the response. And the production has revision cycles that include reflection and maybe don't include reflection, and that include response and the context and the situatedness. And sometimes they're trying to push that forward, and so they're not including it as much, or they're including it more because of that work that they're doing. But her goal is public orientation is not just naming the theory. I know I've been saying that so far, like naming the equation A plus B equals C. It's also the circular nature of the rhetorical practices that are employed to get the outcomes that participant is looking for, to find the community, to join the community, to do something with it towards social change. Okay, so then she goes about showing through examples, bringing in a lot of student voice. She's done that for the last 2 chapters. Here's how students responded. Here's what their response looked like. Here's what their reflection, not just response. Here's what their reflection looked like. Here's how they're naming the skills. And she's pulling these, and she says this a couple of more times, from a class where she didn't think that it was completely effective or as effective as it could have been, where it was rhetorical pedagogy that needed continuous change and revision and reflection. And so then ultimately, this chapter is her reflection on her rhetorical pedagogy and the changes that are possible. And so some of the open-endedness is because she is expecting and hoping that writing instructors who see this, or people who are just interested in writing who read this, see the need for constant reflection on their own practices as a normal part of the rhetorical practices process. So if we have rhetorical practices, to move from, and this is obviously the last chapter and not chapter 5, but to move from being an actor to an agent, reflection is a really helpful and interesting process or skill to use to make a lot of those changes, to accomplish a lot of those goals. And so that's what she's focused on here. And she's also, again, rethinking what a writing class can look like with digital integrated, or digital as the center. And that is her goal with this particular chapter, with chapter 5, is here are some examples I used from my class. Here's some examples of what this can look like. It's a little bit open-ended and a lot reflective for that reason, is here are the possibilities and the ways that using digital, drawing on digital, assigning writing assignments through digital public spheres can accomplish this goal of developing public orientation in students. Here's what it can look like. Okay. So ultimately, because I know this question has come up a lot, and so far, like, do you have to know all of the things about social media in order to do this? No, like you don't even have to be on social media to do a lot of this. This was a point, I will say personally from my book that we made in the book that we published, the information literacy and social media. You don't have to use social media for any of this. Using blogs, even if it's just the genre of blog and not an actual blog, there's a reason I assigned blogs to you all, is a way to shift towards developing public orientation, even if it's never published. Like obviously publishing can be more helpful, but it depends on the developmental age of the student. It depends potentially on the district, or if you're working outside of an actual school, what is allowed and what is not allowed, what is the age of the learners you're working with, and how do we, model all of that. So there's a lot going on in here on how to orient it, how to talk about circulation, how all of these impact writing, and then how we can talk about writing in a bunch of different ways because of that, and that's what she's going for. So ultimately, this is a high-level pedagogy theory with some very specific examples, but also some vagueness so that it can be adapted to your particular needs. And I would argue, especially because I've been working with all of you, your developmental levels, even if that means none of your students ever write, or none of the people in the learning space that you're working with ever write, or if you're just talking about yourself and research that you do or want to do, or again, if you're just talking about you postmasters going into the workforce and considering what are the circulations and what are the audiences surrounding, because the digital is everywhere. This doesn't have to be in a classroom. We want to think about and take seriously the rhetorical practices that develop from our social media uses, and that develop through our social media uses, and that can develop us from actors to agents, but also how and where we consider agency and where we consider some of these spaces to be real life. And by real life, that's where she's bringing in the embodied piece. These have real implications on my actual day-to-day life, and what does that look like? These have real implications on how I'm developing this public orientation in real life, and what does that mean? And I would say, not to like pick a side, Democrat or Republican, but we're seeing that right now in real politics. Who is taking digital signatures seriously on petitions and who isn't? What are petitions forming around? Who is forming them? How are those then being checked? Because the goal is like that signature needs to belong to a real person. And a part of what's going to matter to the politician who's receiving it is that real person with that signature then showing up to the polls? Or is that someone that I am trying to get to show up so that I have a better chance of winning in this particular district? And this is not dependent on one party. This is what both parties are looking at right now. So yes, LaCourt is focused specifically on classroom use, but what I'm hoping you all take away from this chapter, if we bring in the embodied piece of her theories, because she has a whole constellation of theories, this can be and should be adapted to whatever space you occupy, because it has implications for all of the spaces we occupy. So this has implications for me as an everyday citizen, and for me as an educator, and for me as a parent, helping a student go through a public school system. He's going into, he's in middle school. So what is that like, and how's all of that working? Lots of different ways that what she's talking about here can help me with developing the public orientation in each of these different situations slightly differently, but also practices that are transferring and ways that I can actively transfer some of those skills that can be meaningful, whether I'm ever in a classroom or not. None of the goals outside of me being a classroom have anything to do with me teaching students these things. Like, do they influence it sometimes? Sure. But me parenting a 13-year-old, it's not going to help my 18-year-old students, right? They're just like so far away from potentially having children that they don't especially having a teenager, that they don't necessarily connect with those kinds of stories. So they're not shared as much. So again, the embodied piece has implications and transfer from all of these, and hers has transfer to all of your situations. It's just not going to look like a direct transfer. You need to do the thinking through of what can this look like for you? What does it look like for you to assemble and mediate the social, because you're already in them? Reading through her book from your frame, so you're not bringing in your ideas and your background to her ecologies of theories. constellations of theories. What are you taking out of that? Where do you see yourself within that constellation that made this work meaningful to you? Those are the questions she wants you to ask with this chapter. So, teacher, not a teacher, that's what I hope you look at when you read this very last chapter of her book, is where do you exist within her constellation, and how do you see that developing your public orientation, and what are you going to take away from that? Okay, if you have any questions, let me know.